Okay, so you know how everyone's always saying we live in like the most like crazy times ever?
Right.
Well, today we're going to take a look back at a period that was pretty much as wild as it gets in recent American history.
Yeah, we're talking about the 2020 U.S. election and everything that happened right after.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about, who won or lost.
Exactly. We're going deep into like the whole atmosphere, the narratives, the key players, and all the twists and turns that made this period so significant.
We're calling this a deep dive because, well, it's a deep dive.
Uh-huh.
And we're basing this whole deep dive on this, let's just call it a treasure trove of sources we have. And we're calling it Sitoye.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of like our central hub for everything 2020 election related.
Exactly. So Sitoye covers everything from the campaigns leading up to the election to the actual election night, the challenges after the election,
Right.
the January 6th Capitol attack.
Trump's second impeachment, and even his very first moves after leaving office.
It's a lot, so buckle up.
That's
So I guess the first thing we got to talk about is the 2020 election itself.
right.
I mean, let's be real. That election was not just your average election.
It definitely wasn't your typical election season. That's for sure.
The whole atmosphere was just different, so tense.
Grichain Acham really captures that tension like it was almost palpable in the months leading up to November 3rd
Yeah, the stakes just felt so high,
for everyone.
not just for Trump and Biden, but for the whole country.
Yeah, it felt like the entire nation was holding its breath.
And you have to remember what was going on in the background, too.
Right, we're talking a global pandemic, racial justice protests
Mhm.
erupting across the country, and this incredibly divided media landscape.
Yeah, it was like the perfect storm for a super intense election.
And Biden's campaign really tapped into that feeling of crisis, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they framed the election as a battle for the soul of America.
Which is pretty powerful rhetoric when you think about it.
Yeah, it wasn't just about policy differences anymore. It was about something much bigger.
Right? Like the very essence of America was at stake.
And you can see that in how the two campaigns presented their visions right from the start.
Yeah. Riot does a great job of highlighting those contrasting visions.
So let's talk Trump first. His campaign launch back in 2019.
He was all about, promises kept.
Right. He was hitting hard on the tax cuts, the judges he appointed, the pre-pandemic economy.
And his immigration policies.
Yeah, and he basically spent the whole campaign saying his presidency was under attack.
Like he was constantly on the defensive.
It's funny how even his campaign slogans kind of told a story.
How so?
Well, he went from make America great again to keep America great.
Right.
And then by the end, it was make America great again, again.
Like he was trying to recapture something.
Yeah, either that or suggesting that his first term wasn't enough to get the job done.
Interesting take. Now, on flip side, you had Biden.
Totally different vibe.
Yeah, his campaign launch was a direct counter to Trump's narrative.
He even specifically brought up Charlottesville, remember?
Oh, yeah, that was a powerful moment. He basically positioned himself as the antidote to Trumpism.
He was all about restoring national character, bringing back decency and unity.
And don't forget, experience and stability were huge themes for him.
Oh, yeah. He really emphasized that, especially after 4 years of what many saw as chaos and unpredictability.
And you can't forget that line about the tweets.
You won't have to worry about my tweets.
Exactly. Such a simple line, but it really resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, it really highlighted that contrast in style and temperament between the two candidates.
And then, of course, the pandemic hit.
It just threw everything out the window.
Sanjlan Khan really emphasizes how abruptly things changed because of COVID.
Like overnight campaigning became this whole different beast.
Biden pretty much went all virtual.
Yeah, lots of online events, fundraisers, speeches.
Well, Trump, although he had to scale back initially.
He was really eager to get back to those big rallies.
Yeah, those rallies were like his signature thing.
And that difference in approach really mirrored how they viewed the pandemic itself.
It was a stark contrast.
Trump downplayed the virus constantly.
He pushed unproven treatments like hydroxychloroquine, remember?
Yeah, and he was so focused on reopening the economy.
Arguing that the economic damage from lockdowns was worse than the virus itself.
Basically saying the cure was worse than the disease.
Which was totally different from Biden's stance.
Oh, yeah. Biden was super critical of Trump's handling of the pandemic.
He kept saying we need to follow the science.
And that we needed a coordinated federal response.
It was a fundamental difference in how they saw the role of government during a public health crisis.
And then in the middle of all of this, you had that crazy October surprise.
Oh, yeah, Trump getting COVID.
Talk about throwing a wrench into the campaign.
Trump sign
Yeah.
really paints a dramatic picture of those few days.
It was like a whirlwind. First, the reports that he tested positive, then the hospitalization.
And so much confusion about how serious his condition was.
Yeah, and then that whole thing where he had took that drive-by in front of his supporters outside the hospital.
And then back to the White House, dramatically ripping off his mask on the balcony.
It was like a microcosm of his whole presidency.
Unpredictable theatrical.
And just when you thought things couldn't get any crazier.
The country was also going through a massive reckoning on racial injustice.
Following the murder of George Floyd.
And the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted across the nation.
How could that not impact the election?
It added another layer of complexity to an already charged atmosphere.
Biden had to walk this tightrope.
He wanted to show support for the protesters' calls for justice and reform.
But he also distanced himself from some of the more radical demands, like defunding the police.
Yeah, it was a delicate balancing act for sure.
And choosing Kamala Harris as his running mate was a huge statement in that context.
Absolutely. It showed that he was taking the moment seriously.
Meanwhile, Trump went all in on law and order.
Yeah, that became his main message.
And that tweet he sent out, the one that said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts.
Oh, yeah, that caused a huge uproar.
It was so inflammatory.
And then there was the whole Lafayette Square incident,
where they cleared out those peaceful protesters so Trump could have a photo op.
That really became a symbol of his approach to the protests.
For many, it showed that he was more interested in projecting strengths than listening to the concerns of those demanding justice.
It definitely deepened the divisions.
And then, of course, you had the debates.
Which were something else.
The first one, especially.
Oh, man, you rightfully calls it chaotic.
I mean, it was basically a shouting match.
And then you had Trump telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by.
Which was just chilling.
It fueled so much anxiety and fear.
And I think Biden's "Will You Shut Up, Man" really captured how a lot of people were feeling at that moment.
He was speaking for the exasperated audience.
And then the second debate got canceled, remember?
Oh, yeah, because of Trump's COVID diagnosis.
So instead, we got those weird dueling town halls.
Which were interesting because they showed the candidates in such different settings.
Trump facing tough questions from undecided voters.
And Biden in a more controlled environment.
Yeah. Very different vibes.
The final debate was a little more subdued.
They actually used a mute button.
Which helped a bit, but there were still plenty of personal attacks.
Hunter Biden came up a lot.
As did Trump's foreign dealings and the family separation policy at the border.
It was still pretty heated.
But at least they managed to discuss some policy, too.
So after this crazy campaign, we finally get to election night.
The culmination of all that tension and drama.
I can't even imagine the anxiety people were feeling as the results started coming in.
Trump describes it as a nail-biter.
Trump jumped out to an early lead in a bunch of key states.
Which led to him prematurely declaring victory.
Around 2:30 in the morning.
Which in hindsight was a huge turning point.
Because it set the stage for all the claims of a stolen election that would follow.
And this is where understanding the red mirage is so important.
Yeah, can you explain that for those who might not be familiar?
Sure. So the red mirage refers to the phenomenon where early election results might show a Republican candidate leading even if they ultimately lose.
Why does that happen?
Because in many states, in-person votes, which tend to favor Republicans, get counted first.
Okay.
While mail-in ballots, which in 2020 leaned heavily Democratic, take longer to process.
So it's not actually fraud, it's just a difference in how quickly different types of votes get counted.
Exactly, and this was widely understood before the election.
But it created this opening for the Stop the Steal narrative to take hold.
Because as those mail-in ballots were counted, and Biden started gaining ground.
It was easy for Trump and his supporters to claim that something shady was going on.
When in reality, it was just the expected shift that had been predicted.
So as those mail-in ballots were tallied, Biden started to overtake Trump in several crucial states.
By Friday, November 6th, he had enough electoral votes to be declared the winner.
And the major news organizations made it official on Saturday, November 7th.
The final count was 306 electoral votes for Biden to 232 for Trump.
And Biden won the popular vote by more than 7 million votes.
A pretty decisive victory.
And his victory speech was really interesting.
How so?
It was all about unity and healing.
Yeah, Shea points out how conciliatory his tone was.
It was like he was trying to calm the nation down after such a divisive election.
Which was in stark contrast to Trump's reaction.
He refused to concede.
Immediately.
And he launched all these efforts to challenge the results.
Legal challenges, pressure on state officials.
It was like nothing we'd ever seen before.
Shea describes it as an unprecedented attack on American democracy.
By a sitting president.
Yeah, it was really extraordinary.
So let's break down those challenges. First, you had the legal battles.
Right. The Trump campaign and its allies filed over 60 lawsuits in different courts.
Trying to overturn the results in various states.
But, as a Sano case points out, almost all of those lawsuits were dismissed.
And many were thrown out by judges who were appointed by Trump himself.
Yeah, because they lacked evidence or standing.
Meaning they didn't have a valid legal reason to bring the case.
There's this great quote from one of the judges, Judge Brand.
What did he say?
He said, "Calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here."
Oh.
Pretty blunt.
So when the Colts didn't deliver the outcome Trump wanted?
The pressure shifted to state and local officials.
Like that infamous phone call between Trump and Georgia's Secretary of State, Raffensperger.
Oh, yeah, where Trump asked him to find enough votes to flip the state.
It's still mind-blowing to listen to that call.
It really shows how far Trump was willing to go.
And Raffensperger, to his credit, refused to give in.
He stood his ground.
And he wasn't the only one.
Officials in other states like Michigan also resisted pressure to overturn the results.
Which really speaks to the strength of our electoral system.
At least at the local level.
Alongside all this, you had the rise of the Stop the Steal movement.
Fueled by all those claims of voter fraud.
Which were circulating everywhere.
In right-wing media, on social media.
It wasn't just online chatter either.
No, it spilled over into real life.
With rallies and protests popping up all over.
And these rallies attracted a wide range of people.
Some of whom had ties to extremist groups.
And then there's that tweet Trump sent out on December 19th.
The one promoting the January 6th protest in D.C.
Where he said it will be wild.
Yeah, looking back, that tweet is pretty ominous.
It was like a call to action.
And it set the stage for what would become a very dark day in American history.
January 6th.
The day a mob of Trump supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol.
Jim Behan doesn't mince words, calling it an assault on democracy.
And rightly so.
It was a direct attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power.
The day started with that Save America rally,
where Trump gave a speech that basically repeated all his false claims of a stolen election.
He also attacked Republicans who weren't supporting his effort,
calling them weak.
And he explicitly told his supporters to march to the Capitol,
saying, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol. You have to show strength and you have to be strong."
And that's exactly what they did.
They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and stormed the Capitol building.
It was chaos.
People breaking through barricades, smashing windows.
Fighting with police, forcing their way inside.
It was almost surreal to watch.
Sesam Yu described some of the most shocking moments.
Like the guy sitting in the Senate president's chair.
And the mob hunting for Pelosi and Pence.
Chanting, "Hang Mike Pence."
They even built a makeshift gallows outside.
It was terrifying.
And it resulted in real tragedy.
5 people died.
Including a Capitol police officer.
And over 140 officers were injured.
In the months that followed, 4 officers who responded to the attack died by suicide.
And the physical damage to the Capitol building was estimated at over $2.7 million.
It was a devastating day on so many levels.
And Trump's response was really troubling.
He waited hours before finally addressing the nation.
And even then, he continued to claim the election was stolen.
He did tell his supporters to go home.
But it was almost an afterthought.
Later that night, he tweeted, blaming the violence on the fact that the election was unceremoniously and viciously stripped away.
It was like he was justifying the attack.
The fallout was swift.
Several members of his administration resigned.
Including some cabinet secretaries.
And his social media accounts were suspended.
Which was a huge deal.
It cut him off from his massive online following.
And the House of Representatives impeached him for a second time.
This time for incitement of insurrection.
And it was a bipartisan vote.
Which is pretty significant.
The Senate trial raised some constitutional questions.
Since Trump had already left office.
But they ultimately decided to proceed.
And they showed all this footage from the attack.
It was really powerful evidence.
And in the end, the Senate voted 57-43 to convict.
Which was a majority, but not the 2/3 needed to actually remove him from office.
But it was still the most bipartisan impeachment conviction vote in U.S. history.
So while he wasn't removed from office,
it was a clear condemnation of his actions.
So that brings us to the post-presidency.
Trump left the White House on January 20th.
Skipping Biden's inauguration.
He had this farewell event at Joint Base Andrews.
Where he said, "We will be back in some form. Remember us."
And then he flew off to Mar-a-Lago.
His resort in Florida.
At first, it seemed like he was going to lay low.
the social media bans really limited his reach.
And he wasn't constantly in the headlines anymore.
But then Mar-a-Lago became this hub of Republican activity,
GOP leaders started flocking there to meet with him.
including some who had criticized him after January 6th,
They showed that he still had a lot of sway within the party.
even out of office.
It's like he was building a shadow presidency.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into High Lord and home,
What are the key takeaways here?
well, I think the text makes it clear that the 2020 election was a turning point in American history.
It exposed the deep divisions in our society.
And it showed how fragile our democracy can be.
The challenges to the election were unlike anything we've seen before.
And the attack on the Capitol was a stark reminder that words have consequences.
Trump's post-presidency has also been unusual,
He's remained a powerful force.
even without holding office.
It raises some important questions about the future.
Like, how will the belief in election fraud continue to shape our politics?
And what does Trump's ongoing influence tell us about the evolving nature of power in the 21st century?
These are questions we'll have to grapple with as we move forward.
And if you're interested in learning more,
There are tons of resources out there.
you can check out primary source documents from this period
Read academic analyses of political polarization and democratic backsliding.
and explore the findings of the various investigations into January 6th. There's a lot to unpack.
And a lot to think about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Shadareja.
Until next time,
Stay curious.
and stay engaged.